You're listening to 4CRB's interviews and talkback series.
I'd like to welcome Supreme Court Judge David Ashton Lewis to the microphone.
Well, thank you very much, Colin. It's a pleasure to be here, and always, it's a pleasure to see your smiling face.
I am very excited about this show because we're tackling a marquee moment in history. It is the 110th anniversary this month, August, of the start of World War I.
Well, it is. I mean, August the 14th, 1914, was the outbreak. Then, as we said 110 years on, and look back, that no one had any idea of the massive death and carnage that would happen between 1914 and 1918. And lo and behold, we learnt nothing because 21 years later, we did it again.
All right, we might start with the economic and political environment before all of this took place, because it's good to lay out the landscape. Yeah, David. Sure.
Well, obviously war doesn't just come out of nothing. It doesn't come out of I'm angry with you or chauvinism, I want to be better than you.
Something
builds to that. And, of course, we spoke a couple of weeks ago about how the 19th century was empires against empires. Now, empires came about particularly after the British Empire became so powerful by others, the French. The Spanish had done it beforehand, so maybe the British were following, well, if this is what the Spaniards can do, what can we do? And, of course, one of the major competitors with the British was their own ethnic race, Germans, because the British are Anglo-Saxon, and there are Celts in there, of course. So there'd been a gradual build-up over the 19th century of German chauvinism, German wanting to occupy its place in the world, that it believed it should rightfully do so as, one, a major Western European power of significance. So there'd been, from about the 1870s, when Bismarck united these tiny 5 German kingdoms, Prussia, Württemberg, Saxony, Westphalia, and I cannot remember the 5th. They were kingdoms. And then there were massive princely princedoms, and they all spoke German. They all were ethnically German, but they were separate independent countries. Bismarck, Otto von Bismarck, in 1870-71, with the Franco-Prussian War that the Prussians won, of course, the other was Prussia, said this is ridiculous. We should all be one country, one people. So that's what happened. So from the mid-1870s, naturally, the pride that Germans had in their technology, in their science, in their heavy industry, steel, Krupps and Thyssen's, thought we should be at least the equal, if not superior, to our British cousins.
Sure. And
so it started to grow there. And of course, one thing that Britain had that no one could compete with was the Royal Navy, because if you controlled the seaways, you controlled trade, and of course Britain gained massively from trade.
And their navy was very mature in the day. It had been all over the world and discovered a great many things over a great long period of time. So their navy history, as well as their process and policy, was very mature.
It was.
So to try and wave a magic wand and be comparable, sure, some people can sit there and try, but again, it feels like a jealousy of sorts.
Well, if anyone was going to do it, I'd put my money on the Germans.
Sure.
Their industry, their technology, and their will, the German will. And, of course, that's what happened. And in the 1880s and 90s, the Kaiser was developing the German Navy because it became really important that if you're going to have dominance in trade and everything, you've got to control the high seas. Now, there was one problem for them. the British were never going to give it up.
Yes.
So this massive arms race developed in the 1880s.
And tension built, I suppose,
Oh,
if they
course.
weren't going to give up the dominance,
No.
and Germany wanted to take its rightful
Yes.
place in the world. We fast forward to almost a flashpoint, the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand.
Yes.
And one of the questions that, in talking to my son and so forth, is how can the death of one person spark an entire world into war?
Well, here's the danger of chauvinism, because Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the heir apparent to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was falling apart by the outbreak of the First World War. It was made up of today what is Hungarians, Czechs, Romanians, Bulgarians, Serbs,
yes.
Croats, Bosnians. It was really a hodgepodge, but it was the longest-serving European monarchy. The Habsburgs had come onto the throne in 1215, and the Habsburg Empire only ended with the end of the First World War in 1918. So, 603 years. Now, they were never a great sea power. So the Austro-Hungarians controlled land in
Yes.
Europe and Eastern Europe, and so naturally the Austrians are closer to Germans, so there was a natural agreement between Austria-Hungary and Germany, just like there was between the British Empire, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Britain. And so what happened was the old Franz Joseph, he died. Well, we'll go back. He had no heirs. So his nephew, Franz Ferdinand, was anointed the heir to the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And, of course, doing what they would do, he was doing the rounds of all these different countries, Albania, Bosnia, Croatia, Serbia, and unfortunately, from the mid-1800s, and the French building on 50, 60 years after the revolution, there was massive period of revolt in Europe in the 1840s for freedom,
Sure.
for countries to be free. And that caught in the Balkans.
Let me stop you there, David. Freedom from what? Are we freedom from a monarchy?
Yep. And also freedom we can determine our own future. So Serbs are saying, we want to decide what is right for Serbs. And the Serbs were very close to the Russians. Now, Russia and Austria-Hungary weren't bitter enemies, but they kept their distance.
Sure.
Serbs said, if we're going to be close to anyone, we should be close to the Russians, because both of those countries have what is known as the Cyrillic script. That it's not the Arabic script. Anyway, so what happens? Franz Ferdinand is touring around, and he gets to Sarajevo, and a young man, a very potent Serbian nationalist, shoots him dead in the street. His name was Gavrilo Princeps, and he just believed that I want nothing to do with because really the Austro-Hungarian Empire was dominated by the Austrians,
Sure.
the German side. Now, naturally, as empires were building, Germany and Austria had a lot in common, so they became allies. And the Russians, they were allied to the French
Yes.
on the other side of them. So when this prince, this archduke, is shot dead, tensions rise, and of course Austria declares war on Serbia. The Serb did it, and Austria really, even though they were part of this empire, they were independent and building on the drive from the mid-1800s, people wanting to be free.
Sure.
And wanting to determine their own futures, not having Vienna telling them in Belgrade what to do. So what happens? The Austrians go to war against Serbia. The Russians come in and say, this is our little mate. we're not going to watch them dominated by you Germans. And so the Russians come in, and then the Germans say, well, if you're coming in, we're going to look after our cousin, our brother, Austria-Hungary. And so by this stage, the British are still out, just watching. But of course, when you light a match, it's hard to control where the fire goes. And so when the Russians came in, the French said, well, we've got to support the Russians. And so then the British, ever since the Napoleonic Wars, when the French were the bitter enemies of the English, that changed during the 19th century. And so ultimately the British get drawn in. Now, if the British are drawn in, their empire is drawn in. And so that means Canada, Australia, New Zealand, India, everywhere. And so that's why just one death sparked this fire that could not be put out.
Yes, that's very interesting, isn't it? Nowadays, with democracy in the fold, it's not, my cousin got knocked off, so we're in and we're in and we're in and we're in. It feels like dominoes to me. But in that first month, David, give us a rundown.
Well, war broke out on August the 14th, 1914, and basically the Germans, Germany was caught in the Baltic. All its seaports were in the Baltic.
Sure.
And we'll come to the Battle of Jutland 2 years later, where the British had been quite successful in locking up the German high seas fleet really in the Baltic and in a small portion of the North Sea. So anyway, the Germans needed seaports, didn't they, if they were to keep trade helping them. So part of their plan, it was called the Schlieffen Plan, and that was to attack Belgium and France to secure the Channel ports, to secure the places. So right from up round the Bremerhaven, etc., right round past Holland. Holland was a difficult thing because the Dutch really, from a national side, saw them a fiercely independent people, although in many ways the Dutch, which are just the westernmost German people.
Yes.
But their language has evolved over 1,000 years to be different, but they are Germanic. But they always kept a more neutral stance. So the Germans didn't really worry. They thought, look, we can just bypass the Dutch. If we can control from up in the Baltic, near where Denmark sticks out, right round to Belgium, northern France, we've got a massive advantage. And
so in that first month, I can't imagine we had troops storming across borders in that first month.
Well, we did with the Germans. The Germans crossed the Belgian border and took Belgium really quickly.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
And then, of course, everything sparked off and we had those years of war.
We did, and like anything, it's like a cancer. And so the Western powers, England and France, sought to stop the Germans moving further south and thus into France. But they didn't. And the French had a real bad licking in 1870 and 71 when the Prussian army, which was an army a nation in itself, there was no Germany, when the Prussians invaded. And at Sedan, which is in northern France, they clobbered the French. And so that Prussian sense of invincibility then translated into the German Empire. And so the French were not a really good match in 1914. And so in because August 1914, the Belgians fall. Then we get into 1915, and the battle in Europe, Belgium, northern France, starts to heat up.
Yes. Okay, well, that's it's look, a marquee point in our history. It's 110 years, and I often stand back for a minute and go 110 years. We know a lot of the stories, and we know going forward we're going to have the 110th anniversary of Gallipoli next year in 2025. 2025.
Yeah.
So we've got a lot to look forward to. I know some of you may say, oh, for goodness sake, war, but again, knowing about all of these things, understanding all of these things are absolutely imperative to understanding who and what we are.
If you have an understanding of what caused and what was happening before the First World War, what caused and what was happening before the Second World War, I have some frightening news. It's happening now again.
That's right.
Now, the only thing is we haven't reached the stage of a global conflict. But all the preliminaries to massive war between Russia, China, United States, NATO are there.
Yeah, they are sitting there, and there's a lot of common threads. Now, they may not be in the frame of World War I and World War II, where we've got troops storming across borders and so forth, but today's frontier is a data frontier. It is an IT frontier.
Yes.
And we can see a lot of attacks, a lot of things happening in the background that we don't often hear about, but some of them we actually do, where banks are being attacked and financial institutions and medical institutions.
And we've just had our intelligence people raise our threat level to probable.
Yes.
You know, and Australia seems peaceful, but when you heard during the week, they were speaking about mainly young men between 18 and 21 who've really got nowhere that they can feel they belong. And look what's happening in England at the moment,
yes,
or the UK. Massive riots against immigration and refugees. And this feeling you've taken our country away from us.
Look, there is a lot of that, and again, there's a lot of financial components in all of that.
Yeah.
Makes things very difficult when we're all struggling financially. Things are out of reach that used to be a given. Nowadays, you would finish school, you would get a good job, you'd either go to uni or get a trade, and then you would both work together and afford a house. Well, now affording a house seems almost out of reach for some people.
Well, a reasonable middle-class house, when I was a young man, was bought for about $50,000.
Sure.
And if you and your girlfriend, you graduated from university together, if you could save $2,000, you'd find a bank that would loan you. You'd get a mortgage.
Correct.
With a $2,000 deposit.
Look, let's go back to the 110th anniversary of the start of World War I. One of the things, and I know I've mentioned this before, but it is always something that's pertinent in my head. When I first was going to school, I went to a school at Kingscliff, which is just south of the border. They built a brand new magnificent hospital on top of the hill near the school that I went to. And just up the ridge is a little town called Coogin, and it was a farming community. It was just interspersed with farms. There's a school there. There's a few houses in the main street, and lining the main street is some huge pines. Each one of those pines has a family name on it, and each one of those families lost one or more sons in World War I. And when you look at the spread of the farming community, you go, well, almost every family was touched by this.
They did. I mean, I think if people are still interested to look, driving through country towns all throughout Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, Tasmania, New South Wales, Queensland, there's those old fading monuments of a digger with his rifle pointed down or his rifle on his shoulder, and there's names on that, and they are the names of people from that area who lost their lives on the Western Front. And they then since added names to those monuments in a separate little monument for those who lost their lives in the Second World War. So one little act, the shooting or the assassination of the Grand Duke, led to this massive conflagration that killed about 28 million people in the First World War.
Sure.
And
also sparked the Spanish flu, which killed a number
year after
a number of million people around the world.
Yeah, 28 million, I think, died from it. I don't take me as gospel on those numbers, but it was a massive epidemic,
Yes.
endemic. So, all right, so you get this war being fought, and when you had Western powers, particularly Germans, French, English,
Yes.
who were so technologically developed that their killing machines could kill millions or tons of the other side, and the other side's killing machines could do the same. So thus, the war on the Western Front bogged down. No one could break through. And there were a couple of attempts, of course, the Battle of the Somme on July the 1st, 1916. The British had planned to killed roughly 60,000 in the first 6 weeks of that battle.
Hang on, they planned.
Oh, yes, they assessed, we'll lose this many. So the value
I always love that stand back statement of, yes, we're playing chess.
Because it's not, you see, it's not my life, says General.
Yes.
And so what happened was, they knew, because this was an attempt to break the German line, push the Germans back into Germany. They followed, and the Germans would sue for peace. Now, that showed a pretty poor understanding of the German mind, the German will,
and their technology.
The German ability and technology. So what happened? The battle started at 7 o'clock on in the morning, July the 1st, 1916. By 11 o'clock, so some 4 hours later, over 60,000 had been killed.
Wow.
They had lost. Now, normally when you get killed, you get double to 3 times the amount wounded.
Yes.
So, but 60,000 were dead by 11:30 on that 4.5 hours after. And yet they'd all planned, we will lose about that, and believing the Germans the same. Now, the Germans didn't, because their defences were a heck of a lot better. They lost a lot. And July came, 2 months after, a massive sea battle, the only sea battle, really, in the First World War, the Battle of Jutland, between the German High Seas Fleet and the British High Seas Fleet. And you can't even think in terms like this today. The Germans had 16, I can't remember the name of the class of the battleship, but they could match the British dreadnought. And the Germans had 16 battleships, something like 32 battle cruisers, something like 50 cruisers, and 68 destroyers, plus U-boats. And the British had 28 dreadnought-class battleships. They had 21 cruisers, battle cruisers. They had 18 cruisers. They had, I think, 78 destroyers, and I don't know if the British had submarines there. So this battle took place on the 31st of May, 1916. It was basically a draw. And what had happened, the British had, from the top of Scotland, the Orkneys, over to Norway, had lined up all that entrance into the vast North Sea with British warships, and then they had lined up and cut the channel off. So they'd hedged the German High Seas Fleet into a bit of the North Sea and the Baltic. And the whole idea was we don't need to go to battle with them.
Blockade.
We'll blockade them because all we need to do is stop them, and this they could do, from getting supplies.
Yes.
And Germany very much depended on supplies, as did Great Britain. But Britain had a massive empire that could supply it with everything. So what happened was Admirals Jellicoe and Beatty, the 2 top British admirals, went hunting for the German High Seas Fleet under Admiral Scheer and Admiral Hippo. And they ran parallel in this area for a while until they sighted each other. Now, they didn't have radar in those days, but these dreadnoughts could lob a 15-inch shell something like 70 miles, and the Germans the same. So the battle opened, and when you look at the battle line, it's very similar to when Nelson fought the Spanish and the French at Trafalgar some 109 years before. So obviously naval battles took place broadside to broadside. Well, what happened was they slugged it out all day. Now, the British lost more ships because the British they woke up. The Germans had better armour-piercing 15-inch, 13-inch, 10-inch shells. And if you see some of the photographs of the British warships totally blown open on the side, and what happens? Hits the magazines down below. So the British lost more ships. They lost, I think, about 4 battleships, 4 dreadnought battleships. I can't remember the total number, but they lost more than the Germans lost. But the British could wear the loss better. The Germans realised, listen, if we keep fighting, they will eventually just come in and destroy us. So the German High Seas Fleet retreated back into port at Kiel in northern Germany and never left again.
Wow.
The British limped home and licking their wounds and thinking, well, although they sunk more of our ships, we really won the battle because they won't come out and fight us anymore. And that was sensible because had the German High Seas Fleet, which the Kaiser had built up in the 1880s and 90s, had they come out, the British were like a bulldog. You scarred us the first time. We're going to destroy you this time. So that's what we're not celebrating, but remembering.
Yes.
In 6 days' time.
All right, couple of minutes to summarise, David. Let's 110 years since the start of the First World War.
And we've learned nothing because if you study the war in general, but particularly the big world ones, they were a useless waste of time, waste of life, waste of financial resources that achieved nothing.
Gotcha.
And so let us reflect on the 14th of August. What a sad, tragic waste of time.
And waste of life. And
for sure. Waste.
Yeah, just waste. All right, David Ashen-Lewis, thank you very much.
All right, Colin, thank you very much.
You've been listening to 4CRB's interviews and talkback series. Support local online content and become a financial supporter today at 4CRB.com.